So, these recent tariff moves, over 100% tariffs on Chinese imports, are being touted as a bold demonstration of what some call escalation dominance, right?
Yep, they're arguing that by cranking up the tariffs, they can force China into a corner, sort of like, winning a game of strategic chess, right?
Exactly. The idea is that since the U.S. has a huge trade deficit with China, imposing drastic tariffs should, in theory, hurt China more because they're giving up money on sales, not essential goods. But is that really how it works?
Well, that's the big question. They frame it as if by escalating the conflict, they're forcing China into a losing position. But, reality isn't quite so black and white.
Right. And here's the thing. Trade isn't like poker, where one person wins the pot entirely. Trade is a positive-sum game where, ideally, both sides benefit. When you slam on tariffs, you're hurting yourself as much as you're hurting your adversary.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it gets even more interesting because the argument assumes that China is somehow limited in its ability to retaliate. But when you consider that the U.S. relies on vital imports from China, think semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, minerals, it almost feels like the U.S. is playing with, its own fire.
Right. The notion of escalation dominance here is quite flawed. The Trump administration argues that because of the surplus China runs in trade, they're at a disadvantage when retaliating. But the harsh truth is the U.S. is deeply embedded in these supply chains. It's like trusting your enemy to hold your fortress while they prepare their counterattack.
Exactly. I mean, the numbers speak volumes. The trade deficit is enormous. Exports to China pale in comparison to imports. So if you cut off those imports, you're not just limiting Chinese sales, you're inviting shortages of goods that are, frankly, irreplaceable in the short term.
Absolutely. Think about it. If you imagine a scenario where you suddenly have far fewer semiconductors or critical minerals, it's not just an inconvenience. It's like your entire economy's infrastructure starts to wobble.
And that's not even mentioning the indirect effects. Raising tariffs creates uncertainty for manufacturers and investors. It's like everyone's holding their breath waiting for the next shock, right?
Exactly. And then there's this narrative coming from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He uses poker analogies, saying China's playing with a pair of twos.
Yeah.
But in poker, it's a zero-sum game, whereas trade benefits everyone when it flows smoothly.
Right. And that analogy breaks down pretty quickly. In poker, one person's win is another's loss. But with trade, you actually both win from efficiency. So clamping down on trade hurts both sides, especially when one side is as dependent as the U.S. is.
Exactly. It's like if the U.S. was a restaurant that relied on like a single exotic spice from China, if you cut that off without a substitute, your menu suffers, and so do your patrons.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where the argument really stumbles. The idea that because the U.S. imports more, it's somehow less vulnerable simply because it has less at stake. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Definitely. The administration seems to believe that a trade deficit reduces risk, but the flip side is that you're surrendering access to goods that are critical for everyday life and economic stability.
Yeah.
When those goods are missing, everybody feels the pinch.
And there's a broader point here. The notion of escalation dominance ignores that in any trade war, both players lose. It's not a win-lose scenario like, say, a military confrontation where if one side doesn't retaliate, it wins outright.
Right. It's more like both sides are digging trenches in the same yard. The U.S. might think it's toughing it out, but in reality, it's inviting unforeseen domestic costs. Exactly. It's self-damaging warfare, economically speaking.
Now, something that's been bugging me is the claim that this could even just be a negotiating tactic. Even if it were, wouldn't the ongoing uncertainty just scare markets off? It seems like a lose-lose situation.
I see your point. Using harsh tariffs as a bluff might work if it were the only card on the table. But when you constantly threaten and impose such high tariffs, you essentially shake the confidence of investors, manufacturers, even consumers. And then trust in the government starts to erode.
And trust is key. Once you start signaling that you might harm your own economy for the sake of being tough, it invites skepticism. Foreign partners might rethink engaging, and domestic industries could stall investments.
Absolutely. and that has long-term ramifications. In fact, if you look at it, blocking trade doesn't just cut off supplies, it reduces real income and purchasing power. That's not just theory, it's observable in historical economic
Right.
disruptions. It really affects everyday life.
Plus, the analysis points out that countries with trade deficits like the US spend more than they save. So when you cut off or reduce imports, you're not just losing goods. You're also triggering an internal realignment that can be painfully slow and uneven.
Exactly, it's a domino effect. And then there's the risk of stagflation, like what we saw back in the 1970s or during the COVID-induced shock. Reduced supply and heightened prices can create a perfect storm. It's a
Absolutely.
scenario nobody really wants to see.
And then, domestically, this kind of policy leads to specific industries feeling the pain more than others. Industries where substitutes just aren't readily available. That means, ultimately, households, local businesses, even national security could take a hit.
For sure, it's like putting the cart before the horse. Before you start the fight, you need to ensure you have your defenses lined up, alternative suppliers in place. Instead, we're basically rolling the dice without a backup plan.
I get that. But there's one thing I want to push back on. Isn't there a chance that by shaking up the status quo, you might force long-needed reforms in domestic production and supply chain diversification?
That's a fair point. In theory, an economic shakeup could spur innovation and retooling, like changing the game. However, the cost often is too steep. When you abruptly shut off key trade flows without having alternatives ready, you risk a chaotic transition that might leave more scars than gains. And the short-term pain can be immense.
Right. And in practice, the adjustment costs can be brutal. Industries that rely on these imports might not have the agility to switch quickly, leading to job losses and reduced economic confidence.
Precisely, and the analysis really underlines this point by explaining that the U.S. gives up not just money in a trade war, but actual goods and services. And money, while important, is much more fungible than specialized components or raw materials. You just can't substitute a critical
Absolutely.
semiconductor chip with cash easily.
And this brings in the geopolitical angle, too. By softening its own economic foundation, the U.S. inadvertently increases China's leverage over international policy and, the overall balance of power.
Exactly. It's almost like the U.S. is putting its own house of cards in jeopardy. Even if on paper they think they're winning the trade war, the underlying economic damage and loss of strategic autonomy might give away more than they intend. It's a risky gamble indeed.
So the takeaway seems to be that while the aggressive rhetoric might seem intimidating, the actual economic mechanics suggest a far more perilous scenario for the U.S. It's less about winning and more about simply avoiding catastrophic self-harm.
Right on. And if this escalation continues without the proper adjustments, like securing or shifting supply chains, the U.S. could very well find itself dealing with persistent shortages, higher costs, and a reduced capacity to compete globally.
Yep.
It's a high-stakes game with very real consequences.
And all of this ties back to the basic economic principle that in trade, both players are intertwined. Disruptions on one side can have ripple effects that, make it nearly impossible to isolate the damage.
Absolutely. And look, it all circles back to an old adage. You can't cut off your nose to spite your face. In trying to force a trade imbalance, you're actually sabotaging elements of your own economy. A pretty self-defeating strategy, if you ask me.
Yeah, exactly. And once uncertainty sets in, both consumers and investors start playing it safe, leading to reduced investment and slower economic growth overall. It's almost like freezing the wheels before you can even start moving forward.
You said it. And let's not forget, the analysis warns that if the U.S. economy confronts a deep supply shock from these policies, we could see stagflation reminiscent of those 1970s days, with inflation and shrinking output hand in hand.
Right.
That's a nightmare scenario that nobody wants.
And then there's national security at stake, too. Without secure access to essential imports, the U.S. could, in effect, be rendered vulnerable at both an economic and strategic level.
Exactly. It's like launching an economic battle without ensuring your own home front is secure. The whole strategy seems to bet on a sort of contrived superiority in escalation, which in reality just isn't there. It's a lose-lose situation.
So, wrapping it up, while the administration's tough talk might initially mask the underlying vulnerabilities, the tangible risks of such a trade war are daunting. It's a miscalculation that could have serious, far-reaching implications for the U.S. economy.
Absolutely. The aggressive tariffs and the misplaced reliance on escalation dominance might look good in a headline, but the economic fallout, shortages, higher costs, diminished global competitiveness is a recipe for long-term self-harm. It's a high-risk path indeed.
Thanks for hashing this out. It's a complex issue, but breaking it down really shows how, in economics, as in life, you gotta look at all the angles before making those big moves.
For sure, and hopefully this sheds some light on the importance of measured policymaking over flashy, aggressive strategies that might ultimately choke the very system they aim to strengthen. It's a lesson in
Right you are.
consequences.
Until next time, here's hoping for a bit more cautious maneuvering in trade policy, and a recognition that sometimes the tough talk ends up costing everyone in the end.
Exactly. Let's keep our fingers crossed that decision makers see the bigger picture before it's too late.